The lights in the main meeting room of the Starship Harmony's Edge cast long shadows across the metal table. Captain Lee Junho sat at the head of the table, his weathered hands folded as he watched his crew gather for the morning briefing. The ship hummed quietly around them as it traveled through the darkness between stars. Dr. Park Mina entered the room carrying a thick stack of data tablets. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her eyes showed the tiredness of someone who had spent the night reading ancient texts. She took her seat next to Commander Hyundai, who nodded at her with a warm smile. The human members of the crew filled one side of the table. On the other side sat their alien companions, the Vorthak. These reptilian beings stood nearly 7 feet tall with dark green scales that gleamed under the artificial lights. Their yellow eyes were cold and calculating, watching everything with the patience of predators. Kethvol, the lead Vorthak scientist, drummed his clawed fingers on the table. His scales were darker than the others, marking him as an elder of his species. Beside him sat Zeftar, a Vorthak warrior whose job was to protect the research team. Zeftar's scales bore the scars of many battles, and his eyes held no warmth for the humans around him. Captain Lee cleared his throat and began the meeting. "We will reach Kepler 442c in 6 hours," he said. "Dr. Park will brief us on what we expect to find there." Mina stood up and activated the large screen at the front of the room. Images of a dead planet appeared, showing vast ruins that stretched across empty deserts. The buildings were made of some kind of crystal that still caught light even after thousands of years. "This is the homeworld of the Nethys civilization," Mina began. Her voice was soft but filled with excitement. "They were an advanced species that lived here over 5,000 years ago. We know very little about them, but the ruins suggest they achieved incredible things before they disappeared." Zeftar made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Another dead species to study," he said in his harsh voice. "How many failed civilizations will you humans poke at before you accept that most species are too weak to survive?" Mina ignored the comment and continued. "The interesting thing about the Nethys is how they died. It wasn't war or natural disaster. Archaeological evidence suggests they were wiped out by a plague that spread across their entire world in just a few months." She touched the screen and new images appeared. These showed the inside of Nethys buildings, with strange pod-like devices, and walls covered in symbols that looked like writing. "The final records we've been able to translate tell a heartbreaking story," Mina said. Her voice became quieter, more emotional. "The Nethys knew they were dying. They tried everything to save themselves. Parents watched their children die. Healers couldn't help their patients. In the end, entire cities became silent in just days." As she spoke about the fate of the Nethys children, Mina's eyes began to fill with tears. She tried to continue her presentation, but her voice cracked, slightly. A single tear rolled down her cheek as she thought about the ancient tragedy. The Vorthak at the table began to make soft hissing sounds. It took the humans a moment to realize they were laughing. Kethvol shook his head and looked directly at Mina. "There it is again," he said with obvious amusement. "The human water leakage. You're crying over beings that died thousands of years before you were born. How did such a weak species ever manage to build starships?" Zeftar's laughter was louder and crueler. "Look at her face leaking salt water," he said to the other Vorthak. "These tears you humans produce are proof of your weakness. What possible purpose could they serve except to cloud your vision when you need it most?" Commander Hyun started to stand up, anger flashing in his eyes, but Captain Lee held up a hand to stop him. The captain's voice was calm but firm when he spoke. "Dr. Park's emotional response shows her ability to empathize with other living beings," Lee said. "Even those separated from us by time and species. This empathy helps us understand what we study." Kethvol waved a clawed hand dismissively. "Empathy is inefficient," he said. "It wastes energy and clouds judgment. A proper scientist observes facts without emotional contamination. Your species will never achieve true advancement while you allow your bodies to leak water at every sad story." The other Vorthak made more hissing sounds of agreement. One of them, a younger warrior named Vexoth, pointed at Mina's tear-stained face. In our society, such displays would mark you as unfit for important work, he said. How can you trust someone who cannot control their own bodily functions? Mina wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but her voice was steady when she replied. These tears connect me to the suffering of others, she said. They remind me that every discovery we make represents real lives that were lived and lost. Without that connection, we're just collecting data about rocks and metal. Zeftar stood up from his chair, his full height making him tower over the seated humans. Your species mystifies us, he said with disgust. You waste water through your eyes. You make decisions based on feelings instead of logic, and you show weakness to your enemies, yet somehow you've managed to survive long enough to travel between stars. It must be pure luck. It's not luck, Commander Hyun said quietly, but his words carried a warning tone. We've survived because we care about each other, because we're willing to sacrifice for our families and friends. Our emotions make us stronger, not weaker. The Vorthak exchanged glances and made more hissing sounds. To them, the human explanation sounded like the desperate reasoning of an inferior species trying to justify its flaws. Captain Lee decided to end the discussion before it became a real argument. We all have different ways of understanding the universe, he said diplomatically. What matters is that we work together to unlock the secrets of the Nethys civilization. But the damage was done. For the rest of the meeting, the Vorthak continued to make quiet jokes about human tears and emotional weakness. They whispered in their own language, pointing at the humans and making gestures that clearly mocked the act of crying. Mina tried to focus on her presentation, explaining the layout of the Nethys ruins and the equipment they would need for exploration. But she could feel the weight of alien contempt pressing down on her. Every time she showed enthusiasm for a discovery or concern for preserving the archaeological sites, the Vorthak would exchange meaningful looks. When the meeting finally ended, the crew began to leave the room. Zeftar stopped beside Mina's chair and leaned down close to her ear. Save your water for when you really need it, human, he said with obvious mockery. Though I suppose you'll find something else to cry about soon enough. Your species always does. As the Vorthak filed out of the room, their harsh laughter echoed in the corridor. The humans sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. They don't understand, Mina said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain, Lee placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. No, he agreed. They don't. But maybe that's their loss, not ours. Outside the meeting room, the starship continued its journey toward the dead world of Kepler 442c, carrying its mixed crew toward a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about the power of human tears. The surface of Kepler 442c stretched out before them like a graveyard of dreams. Captain Lee Junho stood at the observation deck of their landing shuttle, watching the dead world grow larger as they descended through the thin atmosphere. The planet had once been green and alive, but now only dust and ruins remained. Dr. Park Mina pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the massive structures below. The Nethys had built their cities from a strange crystal material that caught the light of the distant sun and threw it back in rainbow colors. Even after thousands of years, the buildings still looked beautiful and impossible. Landing in 60 seconds, announced the shuttle pilot. The ship shook slightly as it touched down on a flat area near the largest cluster of ruins. Through the speakers, they could hear the wind whistling across the empty landscape. Commander Hyun Dae checked his weapons and equipment one final time. As security chief, it was his job to keep everyone safe while they explored the alien ruins. He looked at the Vorthak team and frowned. Since the meeting yesterday, the aliens had been even more dismissive of the humans, making jokes about crying and weakness whenever they thought no one was listening. Kethval stood near the shuttle door, his yellow eyes scanning the ruins with scientific interest. At least this dead world cannot make the humans emotional, he said to Zeftar in their hissing language. There are no living beings here to cry over. Zeftar made the hissing sound that passed for Vorthak laughter. Give them time, he replied. They will find something to leak water about. Perhaps they will cry for the dead stones. The shuttle door opened with a soft hiss, and the exploration team stepped onto the alien world. The air was thin but breathable, and the gravity was slightly lighter than Earth normal. Their boots crunched on the crystalline sand that covered everything like glittering snow. Mina pulled out her scanner and began taking readings of the nearest building. The device beeped and chirped as it analyzed the strange crystal material. "This is incredible," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "The crystals are not just building material. There's some kind of advanced technology. I'm reading energy patterns throughout the entire structure." Captain Lee walked over to examine the readings on her scanner. "Active energy signatures?" he asked. "After 5,000 years?" "Not active exactly," Mina explained, adjusting the scanner settings. "More like sleeping. The whole city is connected by these crystals like a giant network. It's as if the buildings themselves are one massive computer system." The team made their way through the empty streets of the Nethys city. The buildings rose around them like frozen music, their crystal walls carved with flowing patterns that seemed to move in the shifting light. Every surface was covered with symbols that looked like writing, but unlike any language the humans had ever seen. Zeftar kicked at a piece of fallen crystal and watched it skitter across the ground. "Dead rocks with lights inside one," he said dismissively. "Your species gets excited about the strangest things." But even as he spoke, the crystal he had kicked began to glow faintly where his foot had touched it. The light spread slowly along the ground, following lines carved into the street itself. Within moments, symbols on the nearby buildings began to flicker with soft illumination. Commander Hyun drew his weapon and stepped protectively in front of the civilian team members. "Is it dangerous?" he asked Mina. She stared at her scanner in amazement. "I don't think so," she said. "The energy levels are very low. It's almost like the city is responding to our presence, like it's waking up after a long sleep." The team followed the glowing path deeper into the city, past empty plazas and silent fountains. At the center of the ruins stood the largest building, a crystal palace that rose high into the sky like a frozen waterfall. The symbols on its walls were brighter than the others, pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. "This must have been their most important building," Captain Lee observed. "A temple or perhaps a seat of government." They found an entrance that was tall enough for even the Vorthak to walk through comfortably. Inside, the crystal walls continued, but here they were carved with more complex patterns. The symbols seemed to tell a story, flowing from one wall to the next in an endless narrative. Mina set up her translation equipment and began photographing the walls. Her computer started analyzing the symbols, comparing them to known languages, and looking for patterns. After an hour of work, she called the others over to see what she had found. "I've made some progress with the translation," she said, pointing to a section of wall near the entrance. "This seems to be describing the final days of their civilization. Look at these symbols here. They appear over and over again. I think they mean dying or death." She moved to another section of wall where the symbols were arranged in more complex patterns. And these seemed to be about healing or restoration. The Nethys were clearly trying to find a way to save themselves from the plague that was killing them. As she worked, Mina's excitement grew. The story the walls told was tragic, but fascinating. The Nethys had been an advanced people, masters of technology that could manipulate energy and matter at the molecular level. When the plague struck, they had turned all their knowledge toward finding a cure. "This is amazing," Mina said, her voice trembling with emotion. "They developed technology that could heal any injury, cure any disease. Look at these diagrams. They show devices that could restore damaged tissue, even bring back the recently dead." Kethvol examined the symbols with scientific interest, but his tone remained cold. "Impressive technology," he admitted. "But obviously it failed. They are all dead." "That's just it," Mina said, wiping away a tear that had formed as she read about the Nethys struggle to save their children. According to these records, the technology worked perfectly. They could heal anything, restore anyone. But something was missing. Some final component they couldn't figure out. The team moved deeper into the building, following corridors lined with more symbols and strange devices. They passed rooms filled with pod-like structures that looked like medical equipment, and chambers with devices that hummed with faint energy, even after thousands of years. At the heart of the building, they found the most incredible room yet. It was vast and circular, with a domed ceiling that sparkled with embedded crystals like stars. The floor was divided into sections, each containing different types of equipment. Some areas had healing pods, others had resurrection chambers, and still others held devices whose purpose was unclear. This was their medical center, Mina breathed, their last hope for survival. She approached one of the walls where the symbols were larger and more elaborate than any they had seen. Her translation equipment worked furiously, and slowly the meaning became clear. They called it the Hall of Life Restoration, she read aloud. Here they brought their dying, their dead, hoping to save them with technology that could reverse death itself. Zeftar made a scoffing sound. If they could reverse death, why did they all die? He asked mockingly. Mina continued reading, her voice becoming quieter as she understood more of the story. The technology required something they called the pure essence of life to function. Without it, their machines could only heal minor injuries. They spent their final days searching for this missing element, but they never found it. The symbols on the wall showed diagrams of the missing component. It appeared to be some kind of liquid or fluid that contained special properties. The Nethys had tried everything: water from their oceans, blood from their bodies, even liquid extracted from their tears. But nothing worked. They died with the cure in their hands, Mina said, and now tears were flowing freely down her face. They had the power to save themselves, but they couldn't figure out the final piece of the puzzle. The Vorthak watched her cry with their usual mixture of amusement and disgust. There she goes again, Zeftar said to Kethvol, leaking water for strangers who died before her species learned to make fire. But as Mina's tears fell, something extraordinary happened. The ancient devices around them began to glow brighter. The crystals in the ceiling pulsed with increased energy. The healing pods that had been dark for millennia suddenly flickered to life. The entire room began to hum with power, responding to something it had been waiting for across thousands of years of silence. Captain Lee stared in wonder as the ancient technology awakened around them. "What's happening?" he asked. Mina looked up from the wall symbols, her face wet, with tears just as confused as everyone else. She had no idea that her human tears contained exactly what the Nethys had been searching for in their final desperate hours. The pure essence of life they had needed was falling from her eyes. The ancient Hall of Life Restoration continued to hum with awakening energy as the exploration team set up their equipment. Dr. Park Mina worked at her translation station, trying to understand why the Nethys technology was responding to their presence. The crystal walls pulsed with soft light, as if the building itself was breathing after a long sleep. Captain Lee Junho established their base camp in a corner of the vast chamber. The team would spend several days here, studying the incredible medical technology the Nethys had created. He watched his crew work with pride, even as he noticed the Vorthak continuing to make dismissive comments about human behavior. Commander Hyun Dae secured the perimeter and checked all the entrances to the chamber. Something about this place made him nervous. The way the technology responded to their presence suggested the building was more alive than dead. As a security officer, he had learned to trust his instincts about potential dangers. Zeftar prowled around the resurrection chambers like a predator, his clawed hands touching various surfaces as he examined the alien technology. His warrior training made him curious about any device that could potentially restore fallen soldiers to life, but his contempt for human weakness remained strong. "Look at the crying human," he said to Vexoth, another Vorthak warrior. "She leaks water over every sad story she reads. How can her species function with such unstable emotional systems?" Vexoth hissed in agreement. "Their tears serve no practical purpose," he replied. "In battle, such water leakage would blind them when they most need to see clearly. It is fortunate for them that they rarely face real danger." Kethvol was more interested in the scientific aspects of the Nethys technology. He ran his scanners over the healing pods, recording energy readings and analyzing the crystal matrices that powered them. Despite his cold nature, he had to admit the engineering was impressive. "These devices show remarkable sophistication," he told Captain Lee. "The Nethys understanding of biological restoration far exceeded anything our species have achieved. It is unfortunate they could not solve their final puzzle." On the second day of exploration, Mina made an important discovery. Deep beneath the main chamber, her scans detected another level of ruins. The energy readings from below were different, older and more powerful than anything they had found so far. "There's something down there," she announced to the team. "The crystal network extends deep underground. I think we're only seeing the surface of their technology." Captain Lee studied the scanner readings. "How do we get down there?" Mina pointed to a section of the floor where the crystal patterns were different. "I think this might be some kind of access point. The symbols here are different from the medical instructions. They seem to be warnings." Commander Hyun moved closer to examine the floor panel. "What kind of warnings?" "Something about authorized personnel only," Mina translated slowly. "And something else about defense systems. I think this area was restricted even when the Nethys were alive." Zeftar pushed past the humans to examine the floor panel himself. "Warnings from a dead species," he said with scorn. "What could they possibly do to us now?" Before anyone could stop him, the Vorthak warrior pressed his clawed hand against the crystal panel. Immediately, the floor began to change. The crystals rearranged themselves, creating an opening that revealed stairs leading down into darkness. "Zeftar, wait," Captain Lee called out, but the alien warrior was already starting down the stairs. "I will scout ahead," Zeftar announced. "Unlike some species, we Vorthak do not fear the unknown." The rest of the team hurried to follow him down the crystal stairway. Their lights illuminated walls covered with more complex symbols than any they had seen above. The air down here felt different, heavier and filled with a strange energy that made their skin tingle. The stairs led to a smaller chamber filled with devices that looked more dangerous than the healing equipment above. These machines had sharp edges and components that sparked with contained energy. The walls showed diagrams of what appeared to be defensive systems. "This must have been their security center," Commander Hyun observed, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. "The place they came when the city was threatened." Mina set up her translation equipment and began working on the new symbols. These were more urgent than the medical records above. They spoke of intruders and threats of systems designed to protect the most sacred spaces of Nethys civilization. "We should go back up," she said nervously. "These warnings are very specific. This area was meant to be protected from outsiders." But Zeftar was not listening. He moved deeper into the chamber, drawn by curiosity and his warrior's need to explore every corner of a new territory. His yellow eyes gleamed as he examined weapon systems that had been dormant for thousands of years. "Impressive defensive technology," he called back to the others, though clearly not impressive enough to save them from their plague. He reached out to touch a crystal formation that jutted from the wall like a spear point. The moment his clawed finger made contact, everything changed. The chamber exploded into light and sound. Ancient alarms began screaming warnings in the Nethys language. Defense systems that had waited 5,000 years for intruders suddenly roared to life with deadly purpose. Energy beams shot from hidden emplacements in the walls. The beams were not the gentle light of the healing chambers above, but concentrated destruction designed to eliminate threats to Nethys secrets. The ancient automated systems had no way to know that the Nethys themselves were long dead. "Everyone, down!" Commander Hyun shouted, throwing himself toward the nearest cover. Captain Lee grabbed Mina and pulled her behind a large crystal formation as energy blasts filled the air around them. The beams struck the walls and floor, sending showers of crystal fragments flying like deadly rain. Zeftar found himself caught in the center of the chamber as the defense systems targeted the one who had triggered their activation. He tried to reach cover, but the ancient weapons were too fast and too accurate for even a Vorthak warrior to evade. A concentrated beam of pure energy struck him directly in the chest. The force of the blast lifted him off his feet and threw him against the far wall. He hit the crystal surface hard and slid to the floor, his dark green scales smoking from the impact. The alarms continued to scream for several more seconds before finally falling silent. The defense systems had done their job. The intruder was down. The chamber returned to its previous quiet state as if nothing had happened. Commander Hyun was the first to reach Zeftar's fallen form. One look told him everything he needed to know. The energy blast had burned completely through the Vorthak's chest, destroying vital organs that no medical technology could repair. Is he? Captain Lee began but could not finish the question. He's dead, Hyun confirmed quietly. The other Vorthak gathered around their fallen comrade. Kethvil examined the body with scientific detachment, while Vexoth and the others stood in their characteristic stoic silence. In Vorthak culture, death was simply another fact to be recorded and processed. The defense system was efficient, Kethvil observed. Zeftar's curiosity exceeded his caution. This is the natural result of such behavior. But the humans reacted, very differently. Captain Lee knelt beside the body of the alien who had mocked them just hours before. Despite their differences, Zeftar had been a member of their crew, a living being who had traveled with them across the galaxy. I should have stopped him, Commander Hyun said, guilt clear in his voice. I knew something was wrong about this place. Dr. Park Mina approached the group slowly, her eyes already filling with tears. She looked down at Zeftar's still form and felt the familiar weight of grief settling over her heart. It did not matter that he had been cruel to her. It did not matter that he had mocked her for caring about others. He had been alive and now he was dead, and that loss deserved to be mourned. Even now you leak water for one who showed you no kindness, Kethvil said, watching Mina's tears begin to flow. This proves how irrational your emotional responses truly are. Vexoth made the hissing sound of Vorthak laughter. She cries for her enemy, he said with amazement. How did such a foolish species ever survive long enough to reach the stars? But Mina ignored their comments. She knelt beside Zeftar's body and let her tears fall freely. Each drop that touched his scales carried her grief for a life cut short, her sorrow for the cruel irony of his death, and her compassion for any being who had died far from home. As her tears touched his still form, the crystal chamber around them began to change once again. But this time, the light was not the harsh glare of weapons systems. This time the glow was soft and warm, like sunlight after rain. The ancient technology was responding to something it had not encountered in 5,000 years. Something the Nethys had searched for desperately in their final hours but had never been able to produce themselves. The pure essence of life was finally present in their sacred chamber, carried in the tears of a human who mourned even for those who had shown her no mercy. The soft light that began in the chamber beneath the Hall of Life Restoration spread like water through the crystal walls. Dr. Park Mina knelt beside Zeftar's lifeless body, her tears falling steadily onto his dark green scales. She did not notice the growing illumination around her. Her mind was focused only on the tragedy of a life ended too soon. Captain Lee Junho was the first to see what was happening. The walls around them were coming alive with patterns of light that flowed like rivers through the crystal structure. The energy was different from the harsh defense systems that had killed Zeftar. This light was warm and welcoming, like sunrise. After a long night, Mina, he said softly, touching her shoulder. Look around us. She raised her eyes from the dead Vorthak warrior and gasped. The entire chamber was glowing with soft blue and gold light. The patterns moved through the walls and ceiling like living things, growing brighter with each passing moment. The air itself seemed to shimmer with energy. Commander Hyundai backed away from Zeftar's body, his hand moving to his weapon out of instinct. Is it another defense system? He asked, ready to protect his team from whatever new danger might emerge. But Kethvil was studying his scanners with growing amazement. No, he said, his cold voice filled with wonder. This is not a weapon. The energy readings are similar to the medical equipment above, but much more powerful. Something is activating the restoration systems. The light continued to spread through the crystal network. Above them, in the Hall of Life Restoration, the healing pods and resurrection chambers began to hum with life. Ancient technology that had slept for 5,000 years was waking up, responding to a signal it had been programmed to recognize. Mina's tears continued to fall on Zeftar's still form. Each drop that touched his scales began to glow with the same soft light that filled the chamber. The tears did not simply wet his skin. They were being absorbed, spreading luminescence through his body like liquid starlight. "What is happening to him?" Vexoth demanded, staring at his fallen comrade. The other Vorthak stepped back in alarm as Zeftar's body began to shine with internal light. Mina wiped her eyes and looked more closely at what her tears were doing. Where each drop had fallen, Zeftar's scales were changing. The burned and damaged tissue was healing, regenerating at a speed that should have been impossible. The massive wound in his chest was closing, new scales growing to replace those destroyed by the energy blast. "The tears," she whispered in amazement. "My tears are healing him." The symbols on the walls around them were glowing brighter now, and Mina's translation equipment was working frantically to decode them. New messages were appearing, written in the ancient Nethys language but somehow easier to understand than before. "Pure essence of life detected," she read aloud as the translation appeared on her screen. "Restoration protocol activated. Beginning cellular reconstruction." Captain Lee knelt beside her, watching in wonder as the impossible happened before their eyes. "The missing component," he said, understanding beginning to dawn. The Nethys were looking for something in tears. More symbols appeared on the walls, telling the story the ancient civilization had never been able to complete. The Nethys had discovered that certain biological fluids contained unique properties, but they had never found the right combination. Their own tears were too simple, containing only basic salt and water. But human tears were different. When humans cried from genuine grief and compassion, their tears carried complex proteins, hormones, and electrical signatures that reflected the depth of their emotional connection to others. The tears were not just water. They were a physical manifestation of love and empathy. Grief transformed into healing, Mina read from the glowing symbols. The water of sorrow that carries the deepest compassion. The essence that gives meaning to life itself. Zeftar's body was glowing brighter now. The light spread through his limbs and up to his head, repairing damage and restoring life to cells that had been destroyed. His chest rose and fell in a shallow breath, then another. The Vorthak warriors stared in shock as their dead comrade's eyes fluttered open. Zeftar looked around the chamber in confusion, his yellow eyes focusing slowly on the faces above him. "What happened?" he asked weakly, trying to sit up. His voice was hoarse but growing stronger with each word. Kethval checked his scanners, again, unable to believe what they were telling him. "You died," he said simply. "The defense system destroyed your vital organs. You were dead for nearly 10 minutes. Zeftar looked down at his chest, where the fatal wound had been. His scales were perfect, showing no sign of the injury that had killed him. He touched the spot where the energy beam had struck, finding only healthy tissue beneath his claws. "But I am alive," he said, sitting up completely. He felt strong and whole, better than he had felt in years. How is this possible? All eyes turned to Mina, who was still kneeling beside him with tears on her cheeks. The connection was impossible to deny. Her tears had somehow activated the ancient Nethys technology and brought a dead being back to life. "You grieved for me," Zeftar said, staring at her in wonder. "Even after how I treated you. Even after I mocked your tears and called them weakness." Mina nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You were alive, and then you were dead," she said simply. "That deserved to be mourned, regardless of our differences." The symbols on the walls continued to tell their story, explaining what the Nethys had learned too late to save themselves. Tears shed in genuine compassion contained a bioelectric signature that their medical technology could read and amplify. The tears became a template for restoration, carrying not just the chemistry of grief but the emotional memory of connection between living beings. "The Nethys technology reads the emotional signature in the tears," Captain Lee said, understanding the science behind the miracle. "It uses that signature to remember what life should be like, then restores the body to match that memory." Kethval was studying the data on his scanners with growing fascination. The protein structures in human tears change based on emotional state, he said. Tears of joy have different properties than tears of grief, and tears of compassion for others carry the most complex signatures of all. Vexoth and the other Vorthak were looking at Mina with something they had never shown toward humans before: respect. The being they had mocked for emotional weakness had just accomplished something their advanced technology could never achieve. She had brought the dead back to life through the power of her compassion. "We were wrong," Vexoth said quietly. "Your tears are not weakness. They are strength we do not possess." Zeftar struggled to his feet, still amazed to be alive. He looked at Mina with eyes that held no mockery, only gratitude and wonder. "You saved me," he said. "After everything I said about your species, you still grieved when I died." "Of course I did," Mina replied. "You were part of our crew. You were a living being with thoughts and feelings. Your death was a loss that mattered." The chamber around them was still glowing with the energy her tears had awakened. The Nethys technology was fully active now, ready to heal any injury or restore any life. But it would only work for beings who could produce the special tears that carried genuine compassion for others. This is why the Nethys died, Captain Lee realized. They had the technology, but they could not produce the tears needed to activate it. They were too logical, too detached from emotion. Kethval nodded slowly, his scientific mind processing the implications. They created the perfect medical system, but they lacked the biological key to use it. Their civilization fell not because they were not advanced enough, but because they were not emotional enough. Above them, the Hall of Life Restoration continued to hum with power, its ancient systems fully restored and ready to serve. But the most important discovery had already been made. Human tears, mocked as signs of weakness, were actually a form of biological technology that even the most advanced alien civilizations had never developed. The water that flowed from human eyes in times of genuine compassion carried within it the essence of what made life worth saving: the capacity to love others more than oneself. As the team prepared to return to the upper chamber, Zeftar walked beside Mina with newfound respect. He had learned that what his species considered weakness was actually humanity's greatest strength. And in the crystal walls around them, the Nethys technology continued to glow, finally complete after 5,000 years of waiting for someone who could cry tears of true compassion. 3 days had passed since Zeftar's death and resurrection in the ancient Nethys ruins. The exploration team had returned to the Hall of Life Restoration, but everything between the humans and Vorthak had changed. The chamber still glowed, with soft light, responding to the presence of beings who carried the gift of compassionate tears. Dr. Park Mina sat at her translation station, working to decode the final secrets of Nethys technology. Her equipment had been upgraded with readings from the active systems, making translation much easier than before. The ancient civilization's complete story was finally becoming clear. Zeftar approached her workspace cautiously. The proud Vorthak warrior who had once mocked human tears now moved with quiet respect around the woman who had saved his life. He carried a cup of warm tea, something he had never done for a human before. "Dr. Park," he said formally, offering her the cup. "You have been working for many hours without rest." Mina looked up in surprise. In their language, Zeftar had called her by a title she had never heard from Vorthak lips before: Life-Giver. It was a term of deep respect in their culture, reserved for those who had performed miracles. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tea. "But you do not need to serve me. We are equals on this mission." Zeftar shook his head, his yellow eyes serious. "No," he said quietly. "We are not equals. You possess something my species has never developed. You gave me life through your compassion. That makes you greater than any warrior." Captain Lee. Junyo watched this exchange from across the chamber with satisfaction. The change in Vorthak behavior had been remarkable. What had started as a mission filled with alien mockery had become something entirely different, a lesson in the true value of human emotions. Commander Hyundai was documenting the active Nethys technology with scientific instruments. The healing pods and resurrection chambers were fully functional now, powered by the energy signature that Mina's tears had provided. but they would only work for beings capable of producing similar tiers of genuine compassion. The implications are staggering, he reported to Captain Lee. This technology could revolutionize medicine across the galaxy, but it requires something most species cannot provide: the ability to cry for others with true empathy. Kethval, the lead Vorthak scientist, was running his own experiments on samples of human tears. His cold, analytical nature had not changed, but his conclusions were forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about emotional responses. The protein structures are unlike anything in our biological databases, he announced to the gathered team. Human tears contain over 2,500 different compounds when produced during states of grief and compassion. The electrical activity alone is more complex than many computer systems. He turned to address Mina directly, something he had never done with respect before. Your species has evolved biological technology that we cannot duplicate with our machines. When you cry for others, your body produces liquid that carries the essence of life itself. Mina set down her tea and gestured to the glowing walls around them. I have finished translating the final Nethys records, she announced. Their story explains why this technology failed to save them. The team gathered around her translation display as she began to read the ancient text. The symbols on the walls pulsed with light as she spoke, as if the building itself was listening to its own history being told. The Nethys were masters of science and logic, she began. They built incredible cities, developed amazing technology, and believed that rational thinking was the highest achievement of intelligent life. They looked down on emotions as primitive and inefficient. Zeftar shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the similarity to his own species' attitudes. When the plague struck their world, they used all their scientific knowledge to fight it, Mina continued. They created healing technology that could repair any injury, cure any disease, even restore the recently dead. But the technology required a catalyst, something they called the pure essence of life. She pointed to symbols that showed the Nethys scientists testing various substances. They tried everything they could think of: water from their sacred springs, blood from their strongest warriors, even synthetic compounds created in their laboratories. Nothing worked. The translation showed images of Nethys families watching their loved ones die, while perfect healing technology sat unused around them. The tragedy was overwhelming even after thousands of years. In their final days, some Nethys scientists suggested testing their own tears, Mina read, but their culture had trained them not to cry. They saw tears as signs of weakness and irrationality. Even facing extinction, they could not bring themselves to show such emotion. Vexoth made a sound of understanding. They died because they could not cry, he said with amazement. Not just cry, Mina corrected. They died because they could not cry for others. Nethys tears were simple salt water like most species, but tears of genuine compassion for other beings contained something special, the bioelectric signature of selfless love. She stood and walked to one of the active healing pods, placing her hand on its crystal surface. The pod responded with warm light, recognizing her as someone who could activate its power. The Nethys learned too late that advanced technology means nothing without emotional wisdom, she said. They could build machines to heal any wound, but they could not produce the tears needed to make those machines work. Captain Lee nodded, thoughtfully. So their greatest achievement became useless because they had trained themselves not to feel empathy for others. Exactly, Mina confirmed. And that is why humans can use this technology while most other species cannot. We have not eliminated our capacity for emotional response. We still cry when others suffer, even when those others have treated us badly. She looked directly at Zeftar as she said this, and the Vorthak warrior lowered his head in acknowledgement of her point. Kethval was studying his data readings with new understanding. This explains why your species has been successful despite what we considered weaknesses, he said. Your emotional responses are not evolutionary failures. They are advanced biological systems that serve important purposes. We wish to learn from you, Vexoth said suddenly, speaking for all the Vorthak present. Our species has spent generations eliminating emotion from our lives. We thought this made us stronger, But you have shown us that emotion can be a form of strength we never imagined. Zeftar stepped forward, his posture formal and respectful. Dr. Park Mina, life giver. Will you teach us about compassion? Will you help us understand how to care for others the way you cared for me? Mina smiled, tears forming in her eyes once again. But these were tears of joy, not grief. And they carried their own special properties. The Nethys technology responded to them differently, filling the chamber with warm golden light instead of the blue glow of sorrow. Of course, she said. But you must understand, you cannot learn compassion like you learn facts or techniques. It must be felt, experienced, lived. It requires opening your hearts to the possibility of pain for the sake of others. The Vorthak exchanged glances, realizing the magnitude of what they were asking. To learn human-style compassion, they would have to change their entire way of thinking about emotion and weakness. But as they stood in the Hall of Life Restoration, surrounded by technology that could save any life, but only through the power of compassionate tears, they understood that this change was not weakness, it was evolution. Commander Hyun began preparing a memorial for the Nethys civilization, a marker that would honor their achievements while remembering the lesson of their failure. The memorial would carry a simple message. Here lived a people who mastered science but forgot compassion. Let others learn from their example. As the team prepared to leave Kepler 4042c, Dr. Park Mina took one last look at the glowing crystal city. Her tears had awakened technology that had slept for 5,000 years. More importantly, they had awakened understanding between species that had seemed impossible to bridge. Zeftar approached her one final time before they boarded their shuttle. Life giver, he said formally, I give you a warrior's promise. Never again will any Vorthak mock human tears. We will tell our people that your tears carry the power to restore life itself. And we will work to develop our own capacity for such compassion, Kethaval added. Though it may take generations, we will learn to feel as deeply as humans feel. As their ship lifted off from the dead world, the Nethys ruins continued to glow with the light that human tears had brought to them. The ancient technology would wait patiently for other compassionate beings to discover it, ready to serve any species that had learned the most important lesson of all. True strength comes not from eliminating weakness, but from embracing the emotions that connect all living beings to each other. And sometimes the greatest power in the universe can be found in a single tear shed for someone else's pain. The mockery had ended, the understanding had begun, and across the galaxy, the reputation of human tears would never be the same again.